Lovely. So I think we're going to resume promptly. The next session we'll be going into today is session 3A, and that's about how to engage with your end users, and particularly when your end users might be decision makers or policy makers. So Lucy, are you ready to roll? Yes. Okay, great. Let's begin then. So, lovely. So just the first thing to say is that we will be using Slido in this presentation today. This is the event code. You don't need to put it in just yet, but when you get to it, you'll get a chance to answer some questions, but just to let you know to have your device ready. Okay, so just to have a sneak preview of what this session will be. So we really want to help you think about and understand the importance of engaging with your end user. We want to hear about your experiences so far and reflect a little bit on our experiences of trying and sometimes failing, but more recently probably succeeding to have really positive experiences with our end users. And then we're going to lay out a process for how you can do that engaging in a very structured way. For some people, they might have done this before, but for others, it's kind of starting anew. So we've got a kind of very simple process to follow that we're going to take you through today. Lovely. So it's great at this point, I think, to just be quite specific about what we mean when we say end user. So for this audience for who we're writing for today, we're really thinking of the end user being a decision maker. So that could be a policy maker, but it might be someone who's more broadly a decision maker. And we're not talking about sort of an academic who might read your outputs, but we're talking about ultimately where could your research on climate risk have impact? And that's probably a bit higher up the chain towards kind of policymakers and decision makers. And the important thing to note here is also it's about who could use your research. So at the moment, we might think that a certain type of person is our end user and is the person who uses our research, but ultimately there's probably a broader kind of range of audiences that we might be able to reach and influence. So I want to give you 3 reasons to engage with your end user, I think. So the first reason is it's just really important to understand their perspective and their needs. You really want to know what they need so that you can try and give them that information rather than just telling them what you know. The second reason to engage with your end user is to tailor those communications to meet their needs. And you can't do that unless you know really what they want and how they like to receive information. And then the third reason is to increase the impact of your communications. And that hopefully means that your communication, whatever research you're communicating, has more impact for society. And that's kind of crucial at the moment if you're a researcher on climate risk, especially, but probably in other sectors too, like health. You know, we all do this work because we really want to have a positive benefit for society. So we really need to focus on the impact of our communications. So I'd like to take you into a poll at this point. And the poll is going to ask you, what experiences have you had of engaging with end users? So we just want to field responses from you, basically, about where you're at so far. Lucy, I'm going to need you to return to the Slido card, just the first one we had. And on there is a event code. So if you all can go to slido.com, and then we'll just give you a minute to join the event and let us know what your experience has been.
Okay, I'm just going to move forward so that we can start to see those results coming in. Any ideas, Freya? It's not letting me see the...
Yeah, so there's a slightly different presenting mode if you want to see the Slido results, but I can pull them up live on the screen. So if we just
if you do that, that would be great.
Okay.
Can you show the code again, please?
Lucy, could you put the code back up just for a moment so that people can rejoin? Thank you.
Or slip it into the chat, one or the other.
Yeah, I'll do both.
So just to say that I don't think the poll has started. The poll has not automatically started, which
I will just refresh it. Thank you all. Just bear with us one moment. Okay, I think we are struggling with the poll. And maybe I could ask, Lucy, could we ask people to put their experiences in the chat and maybe just say whether you've had a really positive experience when you've tried to do this, working with end users, or let us know if you've had, you've tried, but it's been really challenging, or let us know whether you've not done this at all before, thought about engaging with your end user. We're just refreshing the poll. So let's do it in the chat instead. So write a comment and let us know what your experience has been, and we'll just have a little chat and reflection on that. Lucy, do you want, while people write their comments in, do you want to reflect on some of your experiences with a...
Yeah, absolutely. So so we have done a lot of engagement with end users as part of the work that we do at the CAU, and we've been lucky to have some really great experiences. But one of the things that I would say is that sometimes things haven't always gone how we thought they would, and it can be difficult to get the right people in the right room, and it can also be really challenging, even once you have more experience of doing this type of work, to be able to be in a position where you are really asking the right questions to get to the information that you need from a stakeholder or from an end user. And the thing that I would say that we have learned over time is that it's really about creating the right conditions for listening. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move us forwards into the next section of the presentation. And I'm going to start to talk to you about a process that we have put together to help people, to help anyone do better end user engagement. Freya, are you happy for me to do that?
Yeah.
So what we're going to do with the rest of the session today is to talk about the process for engaging with your end user. So in the chat, I can see some of you have had positive experiences, but often you can also get lots of different challenges. Now, the process that we've got will give you a framework that can help you feel secure in your approach, that will help you to overcome some of those challenges and think about how you're engaging and building relationships with your end user. Now, the first step in that process is all about identifying who they are. Now, the reason this is important, and it might sound daft, well, you think I know who my end user is that it provides that really clear foundation stone for thinking about having the right conversations with the right person and allowing you then to develop a nuanced understanding of their needs. You might have more than one end user, or you might have end users who sit in similar posts but are changing positions, and actually giving yourself the chance to really think about who those people are and what they're doing will give you a really robust foundation upon which to build all of your engagement practice. Now, I'm going to set an activity for you to do in the session. And what I would like you to do is I would like you to think about the answers to these questions. So we've put together these questions because they help us to think about who those end users are, and actually to think about it beyond being an individual that you perhaps have a relationship with already. Or if you have a bit of uncertainty around who that end user might be or where they might sit, this provides you with a route to get to understand who that person could be. So the first question is thinking about what sectors could my work help to influence. So there's a shift here away from thinking straight away who the person might be into thinking about the area of influence that you want to sit in. The second question is, what decisions or challenges within these sectors can my work help with? And then moving on to start to think more clearly about who is involved in those decisions. And there might be multiple people in multiple different roles who are involved in those decisions, and they each might need different information. And so it's useful to think about what roles they have and pull that apart. So you might end up with a list of different end users from this activity, or you may end up with just one. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to think about your answers for your work to these questions. So I'm going to stop talking for a couple of minutes, and I'd like you to reflect on your own answers to these questions. Okay, everyone, I hope you've had a chance to have a bit of a think about your answers to these questions and get a sense of who your end user is, and maybe think about it a little differently than you have before. We're actually going to give you a chance now to share your answers and think a little bit about who the different types of end users that each of you have. So we're going to have, despite not having very much luck at the beginning of the session with some technology, we are going to have another go. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms. So these breakout rooms are going to be of 3 people again. There will be a few pairs so that the numbers work. But in your breakout room, think about your answers to the question and have a chat about who your end user is, and just share as much information as you can about who that person is and why they are your end user. Okay, Kris, are we ready with those breakout rooms?
We are, yes, indeed.
Fantastic.
Here we go.
Hi there, for those of you that are still in the main room, If you would like to join a breakout room, you may find that you have a breakout room button on the bottom of your screen that you need to click on to say, let me join the breakout room. So I think that there are just a few of us. So for those of you that are here, have any of those questions helped you to think about who your end users are? I think I can ask you to unmute yourself. Would anyone like to tell me about the end users that you have? Claire?
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm employed as such by an Interreg, a French UK project on flooding. So to some extent, it's this organisation within Europe, but within Plymouth, it would most obviously seem at first when I was thinking like it's might be the lead local authority on flooding, but actually because of what we've done, which is go into a community and do a survey about those people, we did something called appreciative inquiry. We went in and just asked the community, and we placed the community first and asked, you know, we didn't put flood on, no flood hats. We just said, what do you like about your area? What would you like to improve about your area? And we took their quotes. We have like valuable information then about the strengths of that community, which is of interest to local councillors. It's of interest, I guess, to any person, any health, sports. Like it's really interesting data. Instead of looking at a place as a deficit, as a social deprivation, the way that we've just gone in and started from that place. I think if you wrote it in a report and wrote what those themes are and what people are interested in, left there, and we've written their words in the first person, so it's them directly talking. I think it broadens it, doesn't it? And it's really useful for me because I'm just writing like a stakeholder thing, and I'm thinking actually I need to keep other people in mind because that's what I'm thinking. Is that of any use? Sorry, it was just.
Thanks, Claire. You know, it's really helpful, and I think you've not just told us a little bit about your end users, you've told us a bit more about how you've spent some time listening to them as well, which is really helpful. And thinking about how the engagement that you've had with them will help you to work with other groups as well. So that's really helpful. Has anyone else got an end user from a different sector that they feel that their work is appropriate for? Okay. So Charles.
Yeah, I'm happy to chip in. My background is in an advisory capacity, so I'm helping organisations with decision making, and particularly decision making if it's either highly politicised or very uncertain. And so what's interesting is that my starting point is a close understanding of the end user, but my end user is my client. So my work is only defined in terms that is useful to them, rather than starting from a piece of work and finding an end user, if you see what I mean. But the points that you make are absolutely right. It's understanding the nuances of framing the issues, framing the decision, and then going in search of information which will help, and often not necessarily help the decision, but help the framing of the problem. So yeah, my end users change their view and their definition depending on even how we frame what we're doing.
Thank you. That's so helpful. And it's also so nice to note the difference between when you're working in the kind of the consultancy sector, where you exist to serve the needs of the client, that there is that you're, you know, as part of your practice, you're very, very used to trying to work out what those needs are and how you can best service them with the work, as opposed to a situation which we sometimes find in academia, where the work happens and then you have to try and understand how it fits together into that policy space. So
absolutely, and there's another dimension to it, of course, the difference between what the users say they want and what they actually want.
Yes.
And that can have its moments.
Yes, and we are going to talk a little bit about that. The difference, we call that the difference between wants and needs. And in the sense that often when you ask people what it is that they need, they will tell you what it is that they want, which is often what they think the solution is to their problem.
And another variant on that, what they think they should be seen to want as distinct from what they want. So you'll often get a politicized version of what the question is, but it's different to what the real question is.
Absolutely. And I love that you're pointing to all of the complexity that exists around this, because I think often one of the things that we think is that this should be easy. We think it should be easy to work out what somebody needs. And actually, it's extraordinarily difficult. Or maybe not difficult, but complex. And it's a process of ongoing dialogue. So yeah, thank you for that. That's brilliant. And as Jeremy says, that's a lovely, lovely distinction. So Jeremy, would you like to talk to us about any end users that you may have, or perhaps if you are an end user?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. So I work at the Met Office in climate modelling. So we build the models and we produce the results, and then we put them out there for policy users to, or other scientists to interpret, and then eventually policy users get to see them. I was this is kind of off topic, but I was kind of diverted by the very first point made this afternoon that said that the atmosphere is behaving in a way that climate modelers don't really understand. So I was trying to get some more information from Mark about that. This is the first time this is my first session that I've attended. So if that was something that was discussed earlier on, then forgive me for my ignorance. But yeah, so a lot of the work is just generating the results and making them available for other scientists to use. And so the interaction there is in the standard sort of scientific framework, which is publication and references and people checking each other's work, and it's improved or it's disproved according to the standard scientific method. So maybe not a communications issue.
And it's interesting to think about who and how within the Met Office there are different people doing different roles. So whilst you're doing that work, there must be other people who are spending their time understanding what the needs of the people that use that work are. So yes,
you're right, Lucy. There's a whole group that interfaces with our sponsors in government who are paying us to do this work, and they are taking the raw scientific results and interpreting them or reframing them in a way that they think answers the questions that are on the minds of our sponsors. So that's, yeah. So I'm somewhat further away from that interface than I think the other people in this conversation.
But it's still very useful to think about, and it's important to think about how all parts of that kind of I guess it's one part of the decision value chain, just a very long way at one end. To think about how what is needed eventually comes back to the work that you do in terms of the direction of focus, and how that becomes a long-term dialogue across a number of people to shape the general direction of that research.
Yes, that's a very good point. Because if you just view it as a purely scientific endeavor, then there are all sorts of interesting scientific questions that the scientists would like to go off and find out more about. But that's not necessarily always the same thing as what the policymakers or the funders of the research would like to know about. So sometimes there is a little bit of a tension between the interesting stuff and the useful stuff.
Great, thank you very much. Everyone is rejoining us from the main room, so from the breakout rooms. Now, I hope you all had a chance to have really interesting conversations. We were very fortunate, and in our room we've had lots of very exciting conversations which have helped us to get to grips with the different roles that people play. We talked a little bit about how it's different if you are working in consultancy in terms of the amount of attention that you need to pay to what your end user needs versus some of the existing practices in academia. Okay, so once you have taken some time to really understand who your end user is, that puts you in a really great position to then start to think about how you can engage with them and how you can begin to really explore their perspective and understand their needs. So that takes us on to the second step in our process. So we always think about the relationship with the end user as being an ongoing dialogue. Now, an actual conversation with an end user about how best to support them and how they can make use of your work is a really good place to start building that relationship. But the reason that we are giving so much time to thinking about how to do that is because sometimes you need different perspectives on what they need to give you really useful information about how you can support them. So some useful ways to think about that are first of all, thinking about the challenges that they are facing and the needs that they feel that they have, so that the things that they want help addressing. It's also useful to think about their purpose. What are their objectives and what are they trying to achieve? And all of these different topics can give you slightly different answers, some of which may be conflicting. So it's useful to start to think about this conversation as being a way of collecting data from your end user, which you can then start to think about how you make sense of to then understand how you're going to meet their needs. So we've got some really simple do's and don'ts to help you with how to begin to have those interactions with the end users that you have identified. So the first thing is to ask about actual examples. If you begin to ask your end users about the concrete specific problems that they are facing, it will be much easier to unpick what goes wrong rather than asking them to think in the abstract. So that can be as simple as asking them about what difficulties they have faced in a particular project, or if they are working on a particular area of policy, what their challenge is in relation to a very specific area of that policy. And that will give you a way in that you can then start to unpick the more general problems from. The second thing is to encourage a baggage drop. Now, what do we mean by a baggage drop? So people sometimes talk about emotional baggage, and often when you think about end users or policymakers interacting with researchers or different communities, you bring a lot of thinking about what that other person does and the ways that you expect them to behave and interact with you to that conversation. A baggage drop is an opportunity to get what you think that might be off your chest and off their chest. So it's a great way to allow that end user to kind of get their gripes out about any difficulties they might have had working with the community that you come from before you then start to get into the nitty-gritty of what they need. Otherwise, what can happen is your entire conversation can be dominated by the things that have happened in the past that they're then bringing to that situation. So my next top tip is a big don't, which is don't just ask what you need. And this came up actually in our breakout room. Now, often there is a big gap between what people say they need or can articulate they need and what it is that they actually need to solve their challenges. So if you simply ask them, what do you need? They can only tell you what they're currently thinking. So you have to find a way to go around that, or through it, or across it, or under it. And the best way to do that is to approach that question of needs from a variety of different angles. And the last one is going to seem really obvious, but the big don't is don't argue. So there is a real it's really difficult to resist. And when we work with clients, we will often say, we need you to sit on your hands when the end user is going to respond to what it is that they're telling you that they want, because you'll want to tell them it's something different. You might want to suggest that they need something different instead, but it's important to allow them to articulate their ideas, and not to try and get into a debate with them about what the right thing is, but instead to find a way to explore different ideas. Because as soon as you start to argue with them, as soon as you start to debate a key point, then you'll just put up a wall that will make it very, very difficult to work around. And the phrase that Kris would use here is about charging elephants. So it's about thinking about not setting off their elephant in that conversation. Okay, so a great way to start and to feel prepared for these conversations is to have some good questions to ask that are going to give you those different perspectives. So we're going to give you a chance to think about what some of those questions are. We're just going to give you, I'm actually only going to give you 3 minutes, but I want you to think about the questions that might help you to understand more about what your end user does, the challenges that they meet when they're doing their work, and what they are trying to make change. So what questions could you ask that would allow you to get that information from them? My only stipulation is that your question cannot use the word want or need. Now, when you've thought of one, I would like you to pop it in the chat, and we are going to crowdsource these questions and put them into your goodie bag from the session, so that we can collect everyone's ideas. Then when you're having these conversations, that you can have a load of different questions that you can go to. So if you can think about some questions to add to the chat now, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes of me being quiet. I am absolutely loving these questions. They are brilliant. Keep them coming for 1 more minute and then we'll move on. Okay, great stuff. So we will take all of the questions that have come up in the chat for this activity and put them into our goodie bag. So next time you are going to have that conversation with an end user, you have lots and lots of questions that you can reach for to get that conversation started. So I think that we can say that we have ticked off the first two steps here. So we've identified their end user, and through having that conversation, we have had the opportunity to explore their perspective. Now, obviously, that is something that you need to do more than once, and it's something that you can build up over time. Now, I mentioned already that it's really important during those conversations to think of that as being data that you are collecting. So you're collecting really useful information from them. And now we're going to move on to thinking about understanding what you've heard. So when you are actually having those conversations in practice, I recommend that you record them. Most people are very happy to have that information recorded, particularly if it's done under the Chatham House rule and you're going to delete those recordings afterwards after they've been anonymized. We use AI transcription because it's a really cost-effective and speedy way of doing it. We use a service called Otter, but you can also use the auto transcription on Zoom. Really recommend it, because what that means is you then have all of that material at your fingertips. And one key step that people often overlook when they're thinking about end user engagement is taking the time to make sense of what you've heard. So it's about taking the information you've collected and reflecting on it to think, well, what does it mean? We do this with all of the information that we collect, and we spend a great deal of time analysing it and making sense of it. Something that we do is think about these three different types of information that we're extracting from the conversations that we have. So firstly, it's thinking about what are the themes, the things that come up again and again. You can then start to think about how the information that you have speaks to those themes. The next thing is do's and don'ts. So you can get clear direction from your end users around what does and doesn't work for them. That can often be really practical information. So, you know, I've got 10 minutes to read a brief, so you know that it can only be a certain length. For example, that's the sort of do and don't that you can have. And the last one is the most important, which is golden nuggets. Though the way that we think about golden nuggets are the information that change the way you think about what's needed. So that's the information that is going to encourage you to completely reframe how you approach risk communication. So altogether, all of that analysis is going to give you some insight into what your end user needs. And from there, that means that you can start to move towards thinking, well, okay, I'm now just about ready to start to construct my risk communications, my information for my end user. Now, before you start to write, there's a really useful process that you can go through where you take the insight that you've got and start to set objectives for your communications. So what that's going to help you to do is it's going to help you to collate the correct content for your comms, because you're thinking really about what it is that you're trying to achieve with the comms before you start to write them. It can allow you to really closely tailor the information to meet your end user needs. This is that point that allows you to transfer what they've told you they need into the information that you're giving them. And the other thing is, once you then have written your comms, if you've got a clear set of objectives that you were setting out to meet, you can use those to evaluate what you've written and make sure that you really are achieving what you set out to do. So how do you do that? Now, we have a way of doing this that we call the do and discover framework. So I will take the information, the insights that I have got from the conversations that I've had with my stakeholders, and I will start to think about, how do I link this up with what it is that I need to say to them? Now, and I think about two different areas that I want to be able to speak to. The first thing is, what is it that the end user that I have been working with needs to be able to do as a result of the communications that I'm providing them with? So what's the action they're going to take as a result of what I give them? The second thing is thinking, what is it that I want them to discover? So that's about what is it that they will know and they will understand as a result of the information that I am giving them. I highly recommend, I'm quite a visual learner, but I highly recommend doing this either on your desk with a pack of post-it notes so that you can move ideas around. Often when I do this to start with, I find that the ideas that I collate can be quite repetitive. So I'll get groups of ideas that I can then hone down into a much more specific objective. Now, recently, we have been doing, obviously, because of the pandemic, we've been doing lots of work online, which means that we can't be in the same room doing this type of sort together. And so we have been using an online tool called Mural, which is very similar to Miro. Many of you will have used both of these before. That's a great way if you need to do this collectively but remotely to make it happen. And this is a screenshot that I have pulled from a Mural board where you can have the same experience of creating those post-its and moving them around. But all in all, what that allows you to do is to get that really clear set of objectives. Now, once you have that, you are all set to start writing your comms and start constructing your information and building really great writing. Now, I'm going to let Freya talk more about that later, and I'm just going to hand over, Freya, to you to summarise here.
Lovely. Thank you, Lucy. I've loved your energy in all of that. It kind of makes me want to go away now and find someone to engage with. But yes, thank you. So I guess what I reflect on as you've gone through that is that engaging with your end user can be time consuming, but it has so many benefits. So it really is worthwhile because you really want to maximize the impact of your work so that it can have a benefit for society. And it's worth noting that you don't always need every step in that process. So you may already have some information from your end users about what their challenges are or what their needs are. Or you might be able to build some of that analysis and reflection in while you're in conversation and be able to kind of iterate that back to them. So I think what this process is just like a really good foundation for you to build an ongoing dialogue with your end user. And dialogue is the key. There'll be rounds of this. There'll be kind of you listening to them, you going away, interpreting it, coming back for another conversation. And you might need to just repeat the process a few times to really kind of be able to zone in and focus in on what it is that they need that you can give them. So I would just say it takes practice to do this. And if you're coming to it completely new, don't worry about being a novice. Just be willing to be there. Because every time you do it, you'll be able to refine your process a bit more. You'll be able to really know what questions really work for you with your stakeholders, which ones elicit the best responses, and find the best way for you to kind of capture that information and go away and think about it. So yeah, that's a really, really interesting process you've just taken us through, Lucy. And I know that you've said that this is something you do with loads of clients, you and Kris. So I wanted to ask now if I could ask you to share some of the golden nuggets. And these are really the things that you could share with people now that you wish you knew before. So before you started working with decision makers, if we can give anyone some shortcuts, what are your golden nuggets, basically? So Kris, can I invite you to come back and share your wisdom as well?
Thanks, Freya. So yes, we've got a couple of golden nuggets, 6 of them ready for you in the goodie bag afterwards. Lucy and I are just going to have a short conversation about some of these. So the first one that we discovered through trial and error almost is that there's always a policy mood music in the communities where you want to communicate. Lucy, what do we mean with that?
Oh, sorry, I've been just joined by Ginger the dog. So Kris, I might just get you to just carry on for one more moment, if that's okay.
Okay, Ginger's making appearances everywhere where he shouldn't be. But the policy mood music is what we mean whenever you run into a sort of a set of implicit assumptions or mindsets that people that you're speaking to have about climate change or mitigation actions, energy transition, and so on and so forth. Lucy, is Ginger gone?
Ginger's gone. Ginger is gone. Yeah. So So there's something really important about when you have a message for policymakers. If you don't understand what the existing policy mood music is, you can often find that it really does feel like it falls on deaf ears, no matter how relevant it is, because it just doesn't resonate with their thinking and the way that they're currently working. So we have some examples from the work that we have already done, and the first one is the fact that integrating renewables into the energy system will be difficult and expensive is the kind of common wisdom. This is the sort of stuff that you think about being the common wisdom. Now, we did some work with some researchers that were trying to think about, well, actually, is that the case? And then when it came to communicating their findings, they really struggled to get them heard because they were pushing against that wisdom. Kris, can you talk us through that a little bit more?
Yes, so the solution that they were talking about was sorting out your storage technologies that will take care of the intermittency of renewables. But no matter how many times they were explaining this in the initial sessions, there was always a response from a certain group of people within the audience that were going, but it will be very expensive to integrate these renewables into the energy system. So it really was about running into that blah, blah, ginger effect that happened at that moment. And we devised a number of different ways to try and get them to articulate that message differently. And at the end, it worked. At the end of the third session, most people that were there understood what the researchers were trying to explain, but it took a bit of trial and error.
And it's useful to think that what's actually happening there is that you are not changing the policy mood music, you are just finding a way to lean on it and to shift it. And it's important, once you've understood what the policy mood music is, you can think about how you're going to try and work either alongside it or within it, or if you are going to work against it, what your pathway is going to be, because you know that if you push too hard, too quickly against that, then you're likely just to get kind of chucked out of the door. So our top tip here is think about understanding what the policy mood music is for the area that you're working in and whether your work sits within it or rubs up against it. Kris, our next golden nugget.
Yes, and that's the risk currency, the idea that every policymaker has these areas of concern, the things that sit inside their elephants. So as we were talking in the session on the risk for elephants, once a certain piece of expertise, of policy expertise or research expertise, once we become a real expert in that, it sits in our elephant and we immediately, intuitively, automatically understand that particular problem. So all of the policymakers that we meet all have their own risk currency. They have the few domains of the areas in policymaking that keep them awake at night, that they understand without a need for explanation. And just some of the bog standard ones that we come across is, of course, jobs and economic growth, but also others like migration numbers, issues of national security, or issues of international relations are others that we frequently see. And what happens, what the challenge is, if we're coming with climate risk information that is too far removed from those risk currencies, we're failing to connect. We're trying to trade in a currency that the policymaker doesn't understand. So helping, figuring out what it is that those areas of concern are from the people you're speaking to is really important, to then try and link as much as possibly, not necessarily with the data, because perhaps you don't have the data, but through the storytelling, through the communication that you put around your data, that will help you to get closer to the risk currency of the person you're talking to. And then they will go like, now I get it. Now I understand why this is also a problem for me, working in a treasury or a financial institution or a business. I can see why these climate risks also affect me.
And just to make an important distinction here, when we talk about risk currencies, we're not necessarily asking anyone who is delivering research or research insight to become an expert in the area that the other person is working in. So we're not saying that you need to become an expert in the challenges that somebody working in finance is facing. It's just about understanding what is important to them so that you can work together to find the point of exchange where the way that you are speaking about risk is relevant to the concerns and challenges that they're working through within their sector. So I think we've probably got time, Kris, just for, well, we should move on to the next one because we're going to run out of time.
Climate risk information rarely leads to clear ideas about policy action, Lucy. Where do we run into that problem?
Oh, we run into that problem all the time. So the thing that we find is that we know that there is an absolutely huge gap between policymakers' ability to take on risk information and then translate that into policy action. So they are always asking on the back of that risk information, the what can I do question. What can I do? What can I do? But we know that it's often the case that policy, that risk information can't or doesn't speak directly to that question. And so what we know is really important is that there is time taken in the relationship between the person providing the risk information and the person who is developing the policy to work together to understand where their policy levers are and how further risk information can be tailored to support the decision making that they need to do, as opposed to just expecting there to be able to be a leap across that gap. Kris, did you want to, have we got an example of where that's worked in from our work?
So, sorry, Lucy, I actually was trying to respond to someone in the chat while you were saying that, so I didn't really get the question.
So I was just saying some examples that we've seen of there being a gap between risk and action and how we can help people to move through it.
Yes, so in a series of workshops that we did for Chatham House, we really tried to make that connection between risk information and people's thinking about policy action. And we had one particular workshop where we had a risk expert come and talk about that particular issue of climate risk and cascading risks and all of that. And all the policymakers in the room were immediately after the presentation asking the risk expert, so what do we do with this information? How do we make this, how do we turn this into policy? And so now, based on everything that we've learned in those workshops, we're developing a sort of engagement tool or protocol to test at COP, in which we're really going to try and help people make that connection between the risk information that they're being presented and then the policy levers that they might be pulling to accelerate the transition to net zero and mitigation action.
Great stuff. Okay, so as well as these, so the three insights or three golden nuggets that we've had so far, which really guide how we think about how we engage with this topic in our work. Those are kind of quite sort of content focused, quite risk specific, but there's some practical ones as well, aren't there, Kris?
Yes, and indeed, someone asked before in the chat and said, oh, this interaction process is very time consuming for the end user, for the stakeholder. And that's absolutely true. And when we started doing this, we realized that people in a policy role work in different timescales than researchers, not just in terms of like the length of a research project, but also in their day-to-day activities. So rarely will they have a meeting that lasts more than 1 hour. 1 or 2 hours is the maximum length of their meetings. So if you try to get these policymakers to come to your events, then make sure that you adapt to those timescales. It's one particular thing to do. Second point is, for those limited amounts of time that you have, focus on that listening in that structured way that Lucy explained in the previous section. So make time for listening rather than thinking, I need to tell them everything I know at this particular moment. And the final one that we have here is that we understood that just bringing experts from different sectors together in the room and getting them to talk to each other was not enough to resolve the differences in practices that they have. Lucy, over to you on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. We've understood that there's a huge difference between moderating conversation and thinking about how you develop a structure that will provide you with the answers to the questions that you have. And a big part of that is about developing a set of really clear outcomes that you're trying to achieve for any interactions that you have with end users. We also recommend that you spend a lot of time, or a decent amount of time, thinking about how you then design a process that breaks down those difficult questions you want answered into simple chunks that people can respond to. It really helps to work with professional facilitators. But when you do find someone who you are going to work with, if you are going to go down that route, look for someone who wants to engage with you on the design and who is very focused on the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, as well as balancing the group dynamics, because it's important to move just that beyond that idea that you have a conversation that you need to moderate in a workshop space, and into thinking about how you develop a structure that is going to give you really great engagement. So I think that's it from us. Is that right, Kris?
Yes, and I want to pick up on one question in the chat from Yanis, like, are there publicly and social media strategies to have the experts come to us? And it's not going to be easy, but I think that you should keep on trying. And what is important is that if you do get a way into them, make it worthwhile for them, make it interesting to them, rather than seeing it as an opportunity where you have to broadcast to them, where you want to explain everything you know. There was one situation 2 years ago, another workshop that we did for Chatham House, where we had invited 15, 20 different policymakers from different government departments to come for 2 hours to a whole day meeting of scientists. So the scientists were meeting for the whole day, and we just invited the policymakers to come in for 2 hours, knowing about these time constraints. What we then did was set up such an interesting interaction for them that they all thought they had been given a networking opportunity. So at the end of the session, they were all saying, thank you for getting us to connect to people that we didn't even know existed in different government departments. So try to do that, try to make things relevant to your end users, try to give them a sense of connection, and they will keep on coming back to you again and again. And over time, you will build up that situation where they will come to you rather than you have to go to them. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Freya.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. I mean, keep putting your questions in the chat, everyone, and we'll try and respond to a few of them and take a look during the break. But we are going to give you another break now. So we are going to come back at 2:50. So you've got about 15 minutes, and then Martine will be talking to us. So thank you. We'll see you at 2:50.